Imagine your jaw throbbing so hard you cannot sleep. It is the middle of the night, somewhere along the banks of the Euphrates 4,000 years ago. There is no dentist, no painkillers, no one within 1,000 miles who understands what is actually happening inside your mouth. Just you, a small clay oil lamp, and the low murmur of a healer reading from a tablet by firelight. He does not look inside your mouth for a cavity. He does not reach for a drill. He begins speaking to something else entirely, something living inside the tooth itself. This is Mesopotamia, and the cure they reached for was not medicine in any form you would recognize today. It was an exorcism. You would have called it a worm. A small, invisible creature, they believed, born at the very beginning of creation, that burrowed into the tooth and gnawed at it from the inside, feeding on blood and rotting flesh until the pain became unbearable. It sounds primitive, a superstition, something to laugh at from the comfort of modern dentistry, with its numbing gel and its bright overhead lights. But look closer, and the story stops being funny, because buried underneath that myth is a level of observation, ritual precision, and quiet problem-solving that historians and translators are still unpacking today. This wasn't ignorance dressed up as belief. It was a working theory, tested against real suffering, generation after generation, and it survived, in some form, for over 3,000 years, long after the civilization that invented it had turned to dust. So what did people in ancient Mesopotamia actually do when a tooth turned against them? What happened, step by step, in the hours after the pain started? And why did an idea this strange, this specific, manage to outlive entire empires, entire languages, entire religions? Woo! Start with the myth itself, because it is stranger and more specific than most people realize. The most famous surviving version comes from a Babylonian cuneiform tablet, sometimes called the Legend of the Worm, held today in the British Museum. Curators and Assyriologists there, including Irving Finkel, who has spent decades reading and cataloging Mesopotamian medical and magical tablets, have pointed to this text as one of the clearest windows into how ordinary pain was explained in the ancient Near East. It does not simply blame a worm. It tells an origin story, layer by layer, the way you might trace a river back to its source. After the god Anu created the heavens, the story goes, the heavens created the earth created the rivers created the canals created the marsh, and the marsh, finally, created the worm. The worm then goes before the sun god Shamash and the water god Ea, weeping, and asks what it should eat and what it should drink now that it exists. It is offered ripe figs. It is offered apricots. It refuses both. Instead, it demands something else entirely: to live inside the tooth, to drink the blood of the gums, to gnaw on the root buried in the jaw. That is the ending of the myth, a creature born from creation itself, deliberately choosing the human mouth as its home, over every sweet fruit the gods could offer it. Why does that detail matter so much? Because a people inventing a random superstition on the spot would not need a multi-generational creation myth, tracing all the way back to the heavens, just to justify a toothache. This was theology treating a medical problem as cosmic business, worthy of the same origin story, used to explain rivers, mountains, and the founding of cities. Toothache was not an accident to them, a random misfortune with no meaning behind it. It was a small war between order and chaos, playing out quietly inside a single human jaw. Every single night someone lay awake in pain. Now, here is where the reframe happens, and it is important to slow down and actually sit with it, because the easy version of this story is the wrong one. Ancient Mesopotamian medicine is often dismissed as pure superstition, a system built entirely on demons, spirits, and spells, with nothing resembling real treatment underneath it. But Assyriologists who have spent entire careers translating these tablets line by broken line tell a far more complicated story. The scholar Samuel Noah Kramer, one of the 20th century's leading translators of Sumerian texts, worked extensively on tablets excavated from Nippur, a city whose ruins have produced tens of thousands of cuneiform fragments. Buried among the incantations and prayers, Kramer identified something researchers now consider one of the oldest surviving medical texts in the world. Not a myth, not a prayer, a pharmacopoeia, a working list of prescriptions, crushed plant resins, specific ratios of beer, oil, alkali salts, and herbs, mixed and applied with clear procedural intent. Instructions to grind, to filter, to apply a paste directly to the site of the pain, and to bandage it. In other words, alongside the ritual, sitting on the very same tablets in some cases, there was also a working pharmacology. The worm explained why the pain existed in the first place. It never replaced the physical, hands-on act of trying to treat it. Picture that healer again, the one from the opening of this story, sitting beside you in the dark. He is not choosing between magic and medicine. To him, that division does not exist. He finishes the incantation, commanding the worm to be struck down. Then, without missing a beat, he reaches for a small ceramic bowl and begins grinding a resin you have never seen before. Both actions, in his mind, are part of the exact same treatment. This is the twist most people miss entirely. The healers of Mesopotamia were running two systems at once, and they did not see them as contradictory. One system addressed cause, in their worldview a spiritual cause, because to them pain without a spiritual explanation was pain without meaning. The other system addressed symptom, using whatever plants, resins, and physical techniques experience had shown to actually help. Layer both together, and you get a ritual that looks like superstition on the surface and a rough clinical trial underneath it. Consider what a Mesopotamian toothache treatment actually looked like, step by step, because the sequence itself is what makes this so revealing. First, the incantation was spoken aloud, sometimes multiple times, addressing the worm directly by name and commanding it to be struck down by the hand of the healing god Ea. This was not a quiet private mutter. It was performed, almost theatrically, often by a class of specialists called the Asu, roughly translated as a physician-priest, a figure who held real social standing and was called for specifically when illness struck. Then, immediately after came the physical intervention. Henbane seed, a plant with genuinely numbing, mildly anesthetic properties when used correctly, was sometimes ground and mixed into a paste applied straight to the gum line. Beeswax has also been identified in later dental traditions descending from this same region, used to pack a hollow cavity and physically block out air, food, and irritation. Warm compresses, oils, and even fumigation, where smoke from burning specific seeds was directed into the mouth through a small tube, all appear across the surviving medical tablets. Think about what that means for the story you are being told here. It tells you that long before anyone wrote a legend about a worm born of the marsh, someone, somewhere, sitting cross-legged in a settlement thousands of years before Babylon existed, was already reaching for a sharpened stone tool instead of a prayer. The worm story was not the beginning of dental care. It was mythology, arriving many centuries late, finally catching up with a much older, much more physical human instinct. The simple refusal to just sit there and suffer. Bring these two threads together and the picture sharpens. Mesopotamian dental treatment was never simply primitive. It was layered. Spiritual meaning stacked on top of physical technique. Technique built from generations of watching which plant actually eased the swelling, and which one did nothing at all. The worm was never really about a worm. It was a way of making an invisible, confusing, terrifying kind of pain feel controllable, nameable, and beatable, while the hands underneath the ritual kept doing the quiet, practical work of trying to fix the actual problem. And here is the part that should genuinely unsettle you a little. This worm theory did not disappear along with Mesopotamia. It traveled, quietly, across thousands of years and thousands of miles. Physicians in ancient Egypt, classical Greece, Rome, and later across medieval Europe and even into early modern dentistry, all repeated versions of the toothworm explanation, sometimes almost word for word, as if the idea itself had simply been passed hand to hand down an unbroken chain of healers who never questioned where it first came from. A concept born from Babylonian mythology outlived the empire that created it by roughly 3,000 years, resurfacing in European folk medicine texts as late as the 1700s. Some rural dental cures sold well into the 19th century still promised, in print, to expel the worm from an aching tooth, a claim printed and purchased by people who had no idea the idea itself was already older than most of recorded human history. Sit with that for a moment. An idea invented to explain a toothache in a Babylonian temple outlasted every empire that ever repeated it. So here is the mirror to hold up to your own life, right now, today. The next time you feel a sharp, sudden ache and you cannot immediately explain where it came from, notice the story your own mind reaches for first. A pulled muscle becomes, I'm getting old. A headache becomes, I didn't drink enough water. Or simply, it's stress. We rarely sit calmly inside unexplained pain. We reach, almost instantly, for a narrative that makes it make sense, even when the narrative is only partly true. Even when the real biological cause is something we cannot see and would not fully understand anyway. You are not so different from the person standing in a Babylonian temple 4,000 years ago, listening to a priest speak sternly to an invisible worm, while quietly, privately hoping the paste on their gums does the actual work. The worm was never really in the tooth. It was in the need, deeply human and impossible to shake, to give pain a shape, a name and an enemy, so that fighting back could finally feel possible.